tonight, actually, I'll come with you.
I've got my jogging balls in my pocket, but Josh is having my wedding speech all over again. So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Jose Grayson. This is Johnny Simmons.
I'm Johnny Simmons.
And most of you, I think we know. What we wanted to do today is tell you a little bit about an organisation called Pure Thought, which is a new organisation which Johnny and I are partners in and which we're responsible for. And just explain a little bit about the concept of Pure Thought, its aims, its objectives, and where we think it can impact on you and how you might be able to help us. And take any questions about it after that. So, do you want to sit? Do you want to stand? Why don't we just
If we sit, can you see us if we sit?
I think you're better off to stand.
Okay.
Sorry.
You can stand and sit. Well, you can sit. I'm going to sit to start.
So, as Jose explained, just so everyone knows who's here and how tonight came about, it came about for three reasons. We work very closely and hope to be able to work even more closely with an organisation that a lot of you have come from this evening, that's Barnet Voice for Mental Health. And Elsie, who sat in the pink top, I was going to put a shirt, who without whom Barnet Voice wouldn't exist and wouldn't be able to reach all the people that it reaches. And as a number of us here who are part of the management committee working with Elsie on that, have talked about Pure Thought and why we set it up, and I'll explain that in a minute. But coming up to the AGM, which is on the 23rd of this month, and is going to take place literally, what's the name of the church?
I can never remember.
Sacred Heart.
Yeah, Sacred Heart of Mary Immaculate, I think.
Okay, so it's the community hall next door to the church, which is diagonally opposite this shop. So basically that's happening on the 23rd of October.
Anyone is welcome.
And that's at 5:30.
5:30 is the refreshments, the business part starts at 6:30.
Brilliant. Yeah. And basically, there's people have come into new roles, and thanks to lots of people, I've been able to stand in the chair of that organisation, and Jose is the treasurer. So, in conversations with Elsie, Elsie knows that we have set up this organisation, Pure Thought, and really what we wanted to do tonight, predominantly for people here from Barnet Voice, was let them know about why we set up a separate organisation and actually how we think that will really complement Barnet Voice. So we're going to talk about a few things which we'll try and cover fairly quickly, and then anyone who wants to know more detail, we'll have questions and things afterwards, and we'll mingle and have teas and coffees and sandwiches and things like that. But
Pastries and cookies and crisps and nuts.
All calorie free.
can't guarantee it.
No carrot sticks.
But there's no labels. So yeah. But also just to point out, I'll mention something, a few of you have heard about something called the Three Principles, and I'll mention that a couple of times during it. But actually on the 23rd of October, we've been able to get agreement to have the speaker, essentially, for that, which is a 45-minute session, really give an introduction into that in terms of perspectives on mental health, is what we refer to it as. So if you're intrigued about that, then also there's a gentleman at the back whose name is Shaul Rosenbach, if you want to wave your hand. So he gets quite a significant mention tonight because in many ways, Jose and I wouldn't be doing what we're doing tonight or the last year if it wasn't for Shaul inspiring us to do that. So for the record, Shaul runs an organisation called Tikkun. It's based in Temple Fortune, and actually has very kindly come here this evening for darting back there in about 20 minutes to go and run a session himself. So we're very grateful for you coming. But if you want to know more about the three principles that we'll talk about, not only is there an opportunity to hear about that on the 23rd, but also through Tikkun, you can get in touch and find out about their innate health program. Is that the best thing to do? Yeah. Brilliant. So, with those things out of the way, I'll explain to you a little bit about what we have, why and what we have done in creating this organisation. So, Jose and I have known each other for 3 years or so, and yeah, more than that. And we met, being completely honest, because of our own mental health issues. In very different ways, in very different circumstances at the time. We met actually in a hospital building not that far from here. He was actually the well one, and I was the rather unwell one at the time. But as we've been introduced before we met by a number of different people because we had a very similar story. And I think what was interesting for both of us at the time was that our own individual stories coming through our lives and dealing with mental health issues that we individually dealt with was that we both had learned that the current system, for all the wonderful effort and work that goes on in it, had not managed by itself to actually help us, certainly not in the time frame that we had felt we needed help. And so over one or two coffees or chocolates, we gradually started talking about what we could do. Jose at the time was working as an advocate for Mind in Barnet, and getting involved in a number of different organisations, and really I was at the point of thinking, what do I do with the rest of my life? My background had been in business, and I'd always kind of tried to carry on with my life, regardless of any mental health issues I had. That was something that, to me, I put to one side, and I just got on and did. And friends and family said, well, you've got to start adjusting your life if you want to live with a mental health issue and not run into recurrent problems. And without going into my personal story, what I had learned, having kind of grown up and understood the mental health system, not just personally, but also family members, my sister, who was first particularly unwell in 1986, was that when people are unwell, it creates an awful lot of panic. And in terms of actually how things are set up to deal with it, we are very good at systems. We're very good at having the idea that actually there is a procedure to get people into hospital, or to get people medication, or to have an idea about trying to find a way to get people the help they need. But unfortunately, having lived through it and met a number of people, including Jose, who've also lived through it, unfortunately those systems break down quite often when it comes to actually connecting with the individual human being who's going through those circumstances, who's coming to grips with a diagnosis that they're being told they have by doctors, by family, and maybe actually they realise themselves that there's something that's not right. But actually there's a big difference between knowing that there's something that needs a solution and knowing how to get that solution. And what we started to realise was that, having spent a lot of time just prior to that myself actually in a mental hospital in Tower Hamlets, was that you go there and you imagine that you're there. Eventually, if you accept that you need to be there because you're not so well, you really want to get help. And I know from my own point of view that when you're actually in hospital, you're turning to the doctors and the care coordinators, and if ever you get to see a psychologist occasionally, but you're turning to these people and you're really putting your heart on the line and saying, actually, I know that something's not right, my life's not working, whatever it is. And I was particularly distressed, I won't go into that now, but at this point, when you need help, you put what I would, without being dismissive, would say is blind faith in a system. And unfortunately, as wonderful as that system is in principle, what we have started to realise more and more is that the fundamental approach to mental health is the problem. And so in getting to the point as to why we set up Pure Thought, we looked at identifying, well, okay, we spoke to psychiatrists, we did quite a lot of research, we spoke to Andy Smith, who sat in the fourth row, who works in the Barnet Enfield and Haringey Mental Health Trust, and waves his hand now. We spoke to lots of different people, we went to the Institute of Psychiatry, and we really conducted as much research as we could to turn around to people and say, well, you work in this field in one way or another, and obviously therefore you're devoted to it, and you don't do what you do to try and just earn money at the end of the day. You've gone into the medical caring profession to try and help people, and whether that's a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a care coordinator or whoever it is, these people are, in the most part, there to try and help. So as we quizzed them and looked at actually trying to understand from their point of view what they would do differently if they could do something differently, we realised that there was a real link between what Barnet Voice does day in, day out, which is speak to service users and try and actually find out what service users want to do, to experience differently, what better care they can have, how it could work better for their recovery. And actually when we speak to the doctors, who a lot of service users, myself at times included, see as the enemy at times, what was quite refreshing was the number of doctors, psychiatrists, really in every walk of that profession, that turned around and said how frustrated they were, that they're working in a system that they know the need is absolute. There's no doubt about how much distress so many people are in and how much help is needed to give them. But unfortunately, the whole approach doesn't really work together at the moment. And unfortunately, we all know that as a country we're in a difficult position financially, and more, we are finding, and Alison especially, who does a support group on a weekly, every Tuesday, for patients at any point in their mental health journey, the number of people that will come in and will say, well, this is how I got into my situation, and it started with a trip to the GP, maybe it started with depression, maybe it started with anxiety. We don't need to go into those details, but so often, unfortunately, the solution comes in terms of tablets. And let me be really clear, I take medication to this point every day of my life, and if I do for the rest of my life, I'm relaxed about that. I'm on an awful lot less medication than I used to be on, and I'm an awful lot better than I used to be. But the significant point is that we're finding that so many doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists are saying, really, we go for the medication first because we don't have other options. So Jose and I went back to the drawing board, and we sort of started thinking, well, he works as an advocate, by voice work, delivering various different services. What can we do working with existing organisations? Shaul here runs an organisation based, as I say, in Temple Fortune, and they've been running for the last, is it 4 years now?
5, maybe 6.
Something that they call an innate health program. I've been lucky enough to help in organising it for the last 3 years, and I have to say it's been an incredibly uplifting experience for me, because the number of people from different walks of life, from different backgrounds and different problems that have come to it and actually found a different route, started to inspire us to say, well, there is no doubt that there is something here that is really working, really transforming. How can we work with Tikkun to actually take that into the mental health arena? I first had a conversation with Andy Smith a couple of years ago about actually what he sees in the trust, and in Barnet Enfield and Haringey Mental Health Trust, actually about the work that was about the work that he's so passionate wanted to do, but seeing the ethics and the various different hurdles that have to be overcome to be able to do that. So we went to Shaul, Jose and I. Should we all check our mobile phones? I can phone everybody if you each give me a number. But really the first thing Jose did was approach Shaul and say, Shaul, you're doing fantastic work here, how can we work with you? What can we do to expand this? And we started learning about some of the difficulties with charity, which is why a lot of you are here tonight to hear what are we doing with Barnet Voice. Because when charities are set up and they identify their objects, and if they're lucky enough, people donate money and maybe leave legacies, and people raise money for you as an organisation. The problem is, ultimately, they're raising money for what you say you're going to do at the very beginning. And for charities to really evolve and start taking on new work is quite difficult, because if someone's giving you money to give bananas to school children, and suddenly you want to feed them pizza at lunchtime, the people who have already given you money for bananas may not be so happy about giving pizza. So Shaul kind of, as I say, inspired Jose and I to go away, and kindly also one of his very, very lovely benefactors as well said the same thing to us. Maybe you need to look when you actually set up a new organisation. So we then came to Barnet Voice, and Barnet Voice is an organisation that's been going since 1994, that does a hell of a lot of phenomenally good work, and is set up specifically for mental health. And we thought, well, how could Jose and I look to work to grow the work that Barnet Voice does? And Barnet Voice were kind enough to send me on a training scheme to look at fundraising for them. And we really started coming up against big problems that when organisations have been going for, in our case, 19 years, some of the funding that you can get, they don't want to give organisations that have been going for 19 years. If your track record doesn't show that you're really continuing to grow, or you've got something really new, they kind of say, well, if you've been going for 19 years, what are you doing? What have you done that justifies? What are you going to do differently if we give you this pot of money? So we started realising, well, hang on a sec, where do we go with this? And just to make one thing absolutely clear, we didn't set up Pure Thought because we had a dream and we wanted to do it ourselves. We saw it that actually there was an incredible need, and the only way to be able to actually start rolling out a program that we'll go through briefly was creating an organisation to raise money specifically to do that. And at the same time as this was going on, Barnet Voice, an organisation that's so dear to so many of us, was in a position of having the money that it had been receiving since 1994 originally from the NHS Trust, from used to get money from various different pots. It now gets it from, so usually from Barnet Council, forgive me, from Barnet Council, from Middlesex University, from a couple of small little organisations that were giving money for things like the Innovation Fund, for allowing fantastic projects to happen for a specific period of time. And Jose is also a director of something that a few of you may have heard, which is the Barnet Centre for Independent Living. That many people heard about BSIL. Show of hands.
Isn't it sort of now part of it?
So Eclipse is part of BSIL. And so once again we went back to the drawing board and thought, well, hang on a sec, if there's an organisation and it's called BSIL and it's got some public money there and maybe we can actually work with it, then let's see what we can do. And the problem we found really since April was that this was set up with public money with a very clear agenda, and without wanting to be rude to anybody that works there, because there's some phenomenally good people who put a lot of effort in, we found that unfortunately it was a large part of a tick box exercise, so to make sure they were offering this, to make sure they were offering that, but there wasn't enough regard for actually how we're going to do it. And well, if you offer an advocacy service, or you offer a support group, just to give you an idea, one of the most frustrating things that a lot of the service users in this borough know was that the support groups didn't have anywhere to operate. So you had men's groups meeting in pubs. And I don't need to point out to you guys that there are people with mental health difficulties who may have had an addiction, who may not necessarily feel so comfortable coming out and meeting people. And the fact that you have a borough-funded organisation that has nowhere for its members, its service users to meet, and they actually start thinking that it's a good idea to get pubs into it. Unfortunately, that's just one of the examples. And we were in a position as Barnet Voice that we were basically looking at how we help grow their future, how we help get them to be in a sustainable position with a strong foundation. And the more we looked at this, and the more we worked with Elsie and the management committee members, we realised that at the heart of what BSIL was trying to do in funding that organisation was actually create a package that was commercially viable, that could even be scaled up and offered to other boroughs. And unfortunately, whilst that has merit, it had really lost sight of actually how it was trying to meet this. So once again, we came back to the position of, well, if we can't do it working with BSIL, if we can't do it through Barnet Voice and raise enough money to do it as Barnet Voice, and if charities like Tikkun or like Mind are quite rooted in where they are, we have nothing to do but set up a new organisation. So Shaul has once again mentored us and guided us quite a long way through the process, and some of you are here purely because of Shaul introducing us. So I hear you all ask, well, okay, get on with it. What is Pure Thought? So, Pure Thought, very simply, is an organisation that we have set up, and we've got a very nice, wide, sweeping strapline. Pure Thought is an organisation set up to improve the world through insight and understanding. And that sounds like a huge mission statement, but there's part of the reason for that is we realised when we started setting it up and saying improving mental health or things like that, unfortunately a lot of trust funds and things don't like funding mental health charities, unfortunately, the more research we do. And as we looked and got a better understanding of how we looked to actually deliver what we were doing, we realised that there were parts of the work we wanted to do, and I'll go through that with Jose in a moment, that went far wider than just mental health. We realised that as we said about thinking, well, how do we do this, education suddenly was a major part of the work we needed to do. And actually, the three principles that Shaul works so closely with are having such a wonderful effect in so many different arenas, aside from mental health. So if we're supporting that and we're working in partnership and tandem with that, then actually it isn't exclusively mental health. But just to be very clear for everyone in the room, and I'm not just saying it because of the audience in front of me, Jose and I set this organisation up with one motivation to start off, and that was to actually effect a real significant change in the current NHS mental health system. So mental health was, from our point of view, right at the heart of Pure Thought. But as we look to actually establish it, thank you so much for coming. Sorry, as I said, Shaul is running a fantastic workshop this evening. And for those of you interested, you can look at the tikkun.co.uk website and learn more about it. But basically, what we're here to do tonight is talk about the mental health side of things. but just to give you a really brief summary, Pure Thought is set up and it works on what we've called 4 cornerstones of the organisation. So those are education, mediation, mental health, and social enterprise. And in the future we'll do many other talks about some of that, but right now we're going to skip straight to the third, which is mental health, and we're going to go through a very simple approach that we've come up with, which we feel is, as an organisation, how we need to actually put in place a plan that isn't just about changing one aspect. Because, and I tried all day to come up with an analogy, and he didn't like my analogy about the window. Shall I give it? Anyway?
What about the bird pooing on the window?
Yeah.
Well, I understood it. I mean, we were working on, did I have a replacement analogy? And unfortunately, I haven't actually come up with one. So, this is the only analogy that we've come up with at all at this stage, although we debated it. Why don't you press on with it?
Okay. So basically, the problem you've got, let's just say you built a beautiful new school. Susie, you teach in a beautiful new school. And maybe you've got these lovely windows. And you know what? Once a week, you have a window cleaner. Once a month, that comes around and cleans it. That's great. Okay. But you're finding that there is a particular problem with birds doing their business on this window. Okay. And so
you understand why I wasn't over keen on the analogy, but it has been.
But basically, well, birds are flappy winged things. That's it. So basically, well, you're the teacher, it's your classroom, and it's really quite disturbing, and you kind of think, well, okay, what are we going to do about it? Maybe we get the window cleaner in every day, and that's just not practical. And so maybe you think, well, you have to at some point start thinking, is it coming from the branch that hangs nearby that window? And then you cut the branch down, but it still happens, and you eventually realise that there's actually a bird nest rooted in the roof of the next door building, and they're just flying past, and they don't do their business in their own home, so as soon as they leave, they do it on the window. And the point we're getting at, and this was a bad analogy, and it's his fault, but basically what we tried to do was look at this system, look at the current offering as far as mental health is concerned in this country, and actually say, well, we don't want to just come along and offer something that is a way of giving people quicker access to psychological intervention, something that I think everybody in this room would understand could in itself make a huge difference. It really could. That's a huge part of what we call delivery, and I'll come on to that in a bit, but just by doing that alone, you come into other problems. And for those in the room that may have taken medication, we know how many times have you perhaps got to see a psychologist and they say, well, you know what, at the moment, whilst you're on medication, you're not really in a place where you can engage with the psychology service. So we'll put you down the line for 6 months' time when you're in a more stable position, and then perhaps you won't be as tired, you'll be able to focus more, and that's wonderful. But actually, you've got the problem that the medication was given as an automatic first port of call. So we looked at that and we realised that for what we actually need to do, and we won't go into all of it tonight because you guys have got a fantastic attention span, but I don't want to crack on too long. But we realised that essentially we need to do education. We need to actually look at the current first ports of call, whether it's GP surgeries, whether or not it's university advice lines like Nightline, an organisation that we're teaming up with, people that people would go to get advice when they're first considering either that they or a loved one or a family member or a friend is experiencing mental health difficulties. And if we could actually look to influence some of those first organisations through education, through actually suggesting alternatives, through growing a network, which Andy knows about and we'll talk about after people have teas and coffees and things, we could put in place a very different program that means you don't have to immediately go for medication. And once again, I'm not here to talk against medication. Medication has a very important role to play, but it shouldn't be, and I don't think any psychiatrist would ever say that it should be the very first port of call.
And I think that's the point, is that we both know from our own experience that, I mean, certainly from my experience, when I first became unwell, the very first thing that my family said you must do is go and see a psychiatrist. I went to Harley Street, to an eminent psychiatrist in Harley Street, and the very first thing that he didn't say, okay, well, let's talk about what's going on, let's understand why it is that you might be feeling the way that you're feeling. The very first thing that happened is that I was put onto SSRIs, I was put onto citalopram, and for me, there's no question that start on medication didn't catch me in the way that it should have caught me, because nobody was looking at what was actually happening in my thinking that made me feel in due course that life wasn't worth living, but instead putting me on the roller coaster of medication without question put me on a downward slope, because sometimes medication is appropriate, but often medication is something that can actually make your situation worse, as we all know, and medication is still so much trial and error. But again, as Johnny says, we're not setting up Pure Thought to be anti-psychiatry. We're fully aware that there are a number of service user organisations who feel that perhaps they are anti-psychiatry, that they simply don't trust psychiatrists, they don't trust pharmaceutical companies, and they don't trust medication. We completely understand that, because so many people have had negative experiences, but at the same time, neither Johnny nor I would say that that's necessarily right. And what I've said from my own experience, what I say sometimes my own strapline when I talk about my own experience, is that if I tried to have psychology by the time I became so unwell that medication needed to be switched around to improve me, telling me to have psychology would have been telling me to talk about my issues would have been like telling me to chat to my liver, is the phrase that I always use. It was utterly meaningless when I got to a certain level of despair and distress that I wasn't going to be able to engage with anybody trying to talk to me about my thinking or psychological help or whatever it might have been. But I think what Johnny's quite rightly saying, what we think is so important and is so wrong about the approach, is that it's about what's the first step in intervention. And the first step in intervention for me was medication, and that was plainly wrong, because it just increased my acceleration down a greasy slope. What we need to do is we need to change the approach that the services have, the NHS or local authority services, the statutory services they're called. We need to change their approach so they don't start with medication. We don't exclude medication, we don't start with it. You start with something completely different, and that's what the education is that Johnny's talking about.
And what I should just say, because it's a really good point to point out, another reason, I didn't add it in earlier, as to why we set up Pure Thought as opposed to just purely working with Barnet Voice and mental health, is that we really started feeling, the more we did research, that we started to understand that perhaps we were coming to represent quite a clear point of view that does exist quite widespread, from the current president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists right down to an awful lot of psychiatrists on the ground and psychologists on the ground who we've spoken to, quite a large number, setting up a steering group, who are all saying a very similar version of the same thing. And so, just to be clear, Barnet Voice is an organisation, and Elsie, if I get this wrong, please step in and correct me, because I've been trying to come up with the right wording, but